legitimately 20 feet away from me.
Oh, you got him, huh?
And
Good for you, man.
it was unbelievable. I was sitting here on the deck and this elk herd ran down. There's like this road down here. And some elk came out off the hill and ran down and hung out right in front of me on this road. And then they just took off into the trees. And then I looked down there and there was this cat rolling around in the dust where the elk had just been. And I was just watching this thing like, holy crap.
Wow.
And I was just sitting there really quietly, and it must just not have seen me. And it just starts walking right up the hill towards me, and it's walking up and it's walking up. And I knew it wasn't a cougar because the tail was short.
Yeah.
But it was big. I mean, it was the size of like a decent sized dog. And it gets up really close to me, and then it was getting a little bit too close. And I was starting to get a little nervous, and so I said hello, and it froze, and I didn't say anything else, and it just froze, and it just stared at me, and it was just staring at me for a second, and I wasn't really moving, and it was all confused, and anyway, at this point I took a video, so I'll send you the video, and it starts just turns around, walks a few steps, turns around and looks at me, and then just sort of meanders off.
Wow.
It was pretty unreal.
You know, I'd hate to deprive our listening audience of Zero the opportunity to see that, man. Now that you've set it all up, can you share that video?
Let me see. I should be able to.
That would be pretty cool.
Let's see. Should be on photos here. Let's see. Yeah, here we go. This video loads. So share screen.
Cool. That's funny. I just randomly saw a video the other day of basically that's what you're supposed to do if you're in the wild and a wolf is approaching you and doesn't see you. Just like make sure you let it know that you're there before it gets too close.
Oh, look at him.
Before it gets too close.
Yeah.
All right. Can you guys see my screen?
Oh, sure can.
Yeah.
Okay.
There you are on the porch, and there he is. Oh, so he's turned around by the time you said hello to him.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yep.
That's really cool.
Well, this is a little after. He's already walked a little bit away from me at this point.
Yeah.
So, oh shoot, he had already. I'd already gotten his attention, and we had just stared at each other for a bit.
Yeah.
And he's already turned around and started walking away.
Wow. So that's cool. Go ahead and zoom in on him again if you can. And is that elk I hear in the background?
Yeah. Yeah, they're just right over to the right.
That's a cool looking animal.
Oh, it is. Very, very cool. So JP, I'm glad you didn't get too friendly with him. I think I'm just gonna hang out here and we're gonna become friends. And he's gonna be our first podcast guest. Yeah. Some people have house cats. I'm gonna have a bobcat. Well, some people have house cats and the scars to show for it, and I actually have a bobcat scar. I'm dead serious.
What?
So I have a bobcat scar because I was attacked by a bobcat. And let's see, I will.
Where?
In the Catskill Game Farm, to be quite precise. I don't want to slander them on it was my own fault, and it was like 50 years ago. So standards were a little different. Literally, it was 50 years ago. I bet it was. I was maybe no, I wasn't yet 11. I was way younger than that. So I don't know.
Good story.
Yeah. So I walked up to a bobcat cage, which consisted of bobcat and a couple of sticks, that hardly anything on a concrete pad floor. Okay, no, I don't want to slander the Catskill Game Farm. Maybe I'm misremembering the wonderful environment they had built for this thing. Okay, but it did have bars, I'm sure of that, and it had a rail, I'm sure of that, because I leaned over that rail and put my hand down and snapped my fingers and said, "Here, kitty, kitty," and walked over in the beautiful way those things walk, cross.
Yeah.
It's kind of a slink, right? And he just walked over and he reached out quite impressively through those bars and dropped a claw in the ring finger of my left hand, and I couldn't shake him off. I mean, he was there.
Wow.
Grabbed a good hold, and finally I did shake him off, and that was the end of our trip to the Catskill Game Farm with the whole family. They're the oldest of, I guess, only 5 of us. I don't remember whether your dad was even born, John. I'd have to do the calculation. He was if I was 9, and he wasn't if I were 8, which I might have been. So anyway, end of trip.
Crazy.
So I've got a little respect for them since that time. They are beautiful animals. They're incredible.
Yeah. And the video doesn't do it justice, obviously. It was pretty like an orange brown, like a ruddy brown, and like with the spots and
Cool.
the face. The face was really striking.
Yeah. I'm gonna see if I can send you a picture, because the scar is quite distinctive. It's hard to miss. No, it's not. It's not so easy to catch. All right, there you are in the background. There's the picture. Now the question is, how do I cleverly? I'll have to email it to myself. Well, I'll tell you what. To the great disappointment of our listening audience, I will do it afterwards. I'll do it on break.
Here, Uncle Tom, do you recognize this truck?
Dimly, I think I've seen a lot of cordwood stacked into it.
Yep, this is it.
Yeah.
I was just doing this morning, and it's the same splitter and the same conveyor that you would have used if you were out here.
Wow. Yeah, a long time ago.
And I think probably the same. I think the same truck too. We've had this as long as anything else.
Yeah. Wow. I was out there in this. Let me get the summer right. I'm pretty sure it was summer of '82. We could do the higher math and figure out. I was out there when your mom was 17 years old, if I dimly remember.
Okay.
Does that sound about right? Anyway, it was close.
Yeah, that sounds right. That's what you've said in the past, anyway.
Yeah. Cool. Well, man, it's great to be out in the woods. Very cool.
True that.
Yeah. Saw some wildlife myself last night. It was on national TV. The presidential debate was on. So it was pretty raucous. Did you guys get a chance to watch?
Yeah,
I listened to it bits and pieces. My Wi-Fi wasn't really working well enough, but here and there.
Well, fits and starts.
I read the Wait But Why summary.
Oh, you did?
Did you read that?
It's hilarious. Wait But
Yeah.
Why is the blog by Tim Urban. Yes, and he couldn't resist. He sent it out today. Yes.
Yeah.
Very funny.
Yeah, I'd be interested to read that.
Yeah. Did you do also, John?
No, I said I'd be interested too.
Oh, you would? Okay, gotcha.
Oh, it's basically just a satire of it, John. It's not like analysis.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
It's as if he was satirizing it live, right? Because it's got a note quality to it, and there are times where he's very plainly popping on exactly what was said and then just gets some smart ass remark in the back of his head and drops that in.
Yeah.
He's very clever with the, as he always is.
Yeah. The debate was pretty boring to watch. Well, not boring, but I mean, didn't learn anything new. And all the analysis I've looked at has just been so consumed in like moral outrage over how unpresidential it was. I feel like I didn't get anything out of any of the analysis I've seen either. But yeah, just a shit show is the best word to describe it, I guess.
Sure.
Yeah. Has your friend Nate Silver said anything interesting about it, John? Or
I haven't listened to a podcast yet about it, but they don't usually release a podcast every day.
that's true. Nate Silver, the head guy at 538.
Yeah.
At least I think he's the head guy at 538. I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know if I had mentioned this to you, Uncle Tom, but he has a podcast that I've been listening to, and it's pretty interesting, especially in the lead up to an election. It's super, super interesting to listen to.
Cool. How do I search for the podcast?
If you just look up 538 in the Apple podcast store, it'll be there.
Good. Well, I use the app. I forget what that is called. I use an app for this, which I think you put me on to, called Castbox.
Castbox, yeah. It's on there too.
Yeah, good. I'll pull it up. Cool. Yeah, probably the biggest, I don't know what you think the biggest story is. Of course, there was the sort of the disappointment, and I haven't followed up yet, but there's a name for these guys. Let me call them the debate committee. There's a formal name for that committee, but there is one, and they apparently have said something about changing rules. They issued something today, but I haven't read what they issued. I just caught a whiff of it.
I feel like they could solve a lot if the moderator was able to turn off people's mics. Although I think that would like really hurt Trump, because it would make him look a lot less powerful and more petulant when he constantly gets his mic shut off. But definitely something needs to be done.
Yeah. I missed the start of the debate, and I've recorded it, but I haven't gone back and watched it, so I didn't see everything. I think I caught it about 20 minutes in. I had another meeting that conflicted. I think the biggest news story I've seen is his response to the Proud Boys, the baiting, really, or the question. I think it's a legitimate question for Wallace to ask, or one could debate that. And then, of course, Biden baited him, which went back and forth. But I mean, in terms of baiting one another. But Trump answered that question, but he answered it. Let me see if I get the wording exactly right.
Yeah.
Right? Stand back and stand by. I think that's the precise word.
Which I'm still, I mean, his wording afterwards, that definitely is the biggest news story takeaway. Trump refusing to condemn white supremacy, telling the Proud Boys to stand by. Yeah, I mean, it definitely.
Say stand back. He did say stand back.
Right? Yeah, he said stand back and stand by, which I don't even know if it was like a misusing his words incorrectly. I don't know if it was like some sneaky way to act like he was telling him to stand back. I mean, there definitely were stand by is a weird way to say it, but you don't say stand back and then stand by. Like, the phrasing doesn't even make sense to me. I think people would conclude that he was like trying to look like he was condemning them, but actually not at all, in a very not sneaky way. But it was just such weird phrasing. I don't even know what to make of it practically.
Well, there are many who say, and here I don't want to quote the many, or I'd be rather like our president, who constantly says, many people say this. The question is who? The answer is many people. Just look on the internet. But Tim Scott, for one, right, said that's a misstatement, that he misspoke. At least I think he misspoke, and if he did, he should retract it. Right?
Yeah.
And if he didn't, we'll know he didn't misspoke. If he doesn't that's just to take one person who's in the news. But there are many, and now I won't quote any because there literally are a number of them. I think it's a pretty popular claim on some news outlets to say that he wasn't simply calling them off in a strange way, right? He was actually threatening with them.
Yeah,
that's the function of standby.
Yeah, and it's certainly not a hard conclusion to reach, especially when his next words were about like people watching the polls and stuff like that. So yeah, I mean, I think he definitely needs to clarify that, because it's really easy to,
those things weren't. I don't remember those two. Those two. You were talking about two things, right? The stand back and stand by, and then people need to watch the polls and make sure everything's okay. I forget his exact phrasing there, but those happened pretty far apart in my memory. Like, that wasn't one right after the other. I thought the voting. I thought he made the later comment when they were talking about the integrity of the election and agreeing with the election, which happened later in the show, and the decrying white supremacy was earlier.
I thought he did make a statement about election fraud and how he needs people to watch the polls immediately after that statement, or within like a paragraph or something. I could be totally wrong, but that was my recollection.
Well, we could consult Tim Urban and find out.
It's true.
Maybe not. It might give us a clue, actually. I'm sure there's actually a real transcript somewhere. But
it'd be way less
fun. It wouldn't be as fun to look for it. Right?
Yeah, I don't know if it's like a comparison or something, but it seems that the Republican turnaround in this case, or whataboutism basically, is if you ask us to condemn the violence of these right-wing groups, then we need to ask you to condemn the violence of these left-wing groups. And the one that the right wing likes to identify, or their easiest identifiable target, is Antifa. And I don't know, it always seems to me like it's just a way to hand wave it away. But they're like, well, Antifa isn't an organization, so I don't have to respond to that. Which I don't really know how to get a handle on. Are they saying there is no violence being committed by Antifa, or all the violence being committed is for a good reason, or it's not? You can't ever identify who is Antifa and who isn't, so you can't ever say who's committing the violence.
Yeah. Let's go after that in a minute. JP, maybe you've got something to say about it, and I have a thing or two to say about it.
It doesn't say in I mean, I'm just looking at Tim Urban's thing, and it doesn't say.
Okay. Let's see. I wish I could remember with crystal clarity, but there's no question that Biden last night said the following. There's no question in my mind, which is all I should say, that Biden made it very clear that violence, that peaceful protest is let's see, let me say, thumbs up. He approved it in some way, right? I forget his precise words, but what he also said, he very clearly distinguished it from violent protests, which he unequivocally resisted, right?
Yeah, and actually,
I don't think denounced wouldn't be too strong a word. I don't think.
He did make a really good statement when he spoke at Kenosha, though, about condemning violence.
Also,
so I would say, I mean, Biden certainly has been pretty clear. I wouldn't say that about the party as a whole, but I think Biden's actually been pretty articulate on condemning protests.
Yeah, I think I didn't hear a statement about around Kenosha, but in the debate, it seemed to me he was clear in a way that the president was not quite so clear.
Certainly.
You might find, Trump has a way of head and shoulder faking practically everything. So there's probably a moment that one could interpret. He probably had muttered "sure" under his breath in the middle of a sentence, right, somewhere. But when you put him on stage, he won't say. I mean, when you drop up and everyone stops and turns and looks at him and wants a clear statement from him, he wouldn't give that. Right, but he may have given it elsewhere, and I wouldn't be surprised to see if that is, if you find echoes of that. I'd like to see again that little clip where Wallace starts to ask the question, and Trump is saying something the whole time. I don't think that's not a particularly egregious overstatement. That is, he wasn't drowning him out like he did in some other places, but he was reacting mid-sentence, right, back and forth, iteratively, almost mid-syllable. A lot of control. So maybe he also. So I don't mean to say that Biden was clearly on one side and Trump was clearly on the other. I don't mean to say it's an open and shut case there. Although I also think that the partisan case for Trump's resistance or his denunciation of violence, that partisan case would be more of a reach than in the case of Joe Biden. I think that's reasonably clear in my mind, anyway, my memory. Maybe that's a partisan claim. But let's jump to Antifa for a minute, right? I just wanted to clear or set behind, not imply that what we're saying about Antifa, was washed into the presidential debate exactly, right? We're sort of leaving that behind for a moment. Claims made about Antifa is that insofar as it's an organization, it's a very small one. It's mostly a loose affiliation of principle. And there's not a large organization associated with it. As opposed to, I heard one commentator, let's see if I can remember the various sources. I can't. Let's see if I can even remember the show. And the show, this was on NPR, and it was on NPR early this afternoon. But I couldn't say who the author, who this particular source was. I don't even remember the moment if I recognized the guy's name. But in that conversation, he made the point, and I've heard it dimly elsewhere, that the Proud Boys, the story goes, his story went, have an organization and chapters, and it's a much more organized organization. And Antifa is not like that. Antifa may have some small organization, but what sort of passes as Antifa is more like Antifa-inspired, principle-inspired rallies or something like that, and you could throw the word Antifa at all of that, but it's much more loosely knit. Now, whether that is true or not, I don't know, but that's part of the story that you hear. I've heard it more than once anyway.
Yeah, I think, I would agree. Yeah, I mean, I think Republicans just want to put a name to what the face of the violence they see. And so I think the easiest thing they've come up with is Antifa.
Sure. It's the new Occupy. Remember the Occupy movement, how many years ago? Well, it was during the last
99?
Pardon me?
Oh, wow, I'm thinking of, sorry.
Yeah.
I was thinking of like the World Bank protests.
Well, yeah. I mean,
Wasn't that called Occupy in Seattle?
Yes, but I think that, so what year do you think that was, that when it first showed up? I actually don't know.
98 or 99, I think.
Okay. Yeah, my memory's not so good there in terms of when that was, but.
And then again in 2009.
Right. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And it ran up, it was, right. Interesting to trace the history of the interaction between the Sanders campaign and the Occupy movement. And I'm not asserting, I'm asking what that relationship was. I've got a dim recollection of at least some conversation tossed back and forth or some affiliation. And I wouldn't be surprised at all whether folks who were part of that Occupy initiative were generally sympathetic, or would they be called Bernie Bros these days?
I'm sure. I'd be shocked if the overlap between that group wasn't almost, if the Occupy group wasn't almost completely Bernie supporters. Given my recollection of that movement,
right,
and what they stood for, I can't imagine them supporting anyone else.
Yeah, you might find some Tulsi Gabbard support in that space. It's surprising how her support cuts across. You'll find an awful lot of Bernie Tulsi. I shouldn't say how much. It could. I know a lot of it because I follow those folks. So there is a very strong Bernie Tulsi overlap. Debating about which one of them should be president and which one should be vice president was one thing I saw. On the other hand, Tulsi has different types of support for different sorts of reasons. Right? Bernie's more nationally focused and less internationally focused. I think Tulsi is, put it this way, gets a name for herself from her pretty clear statements about U.S. interventionism in various places where that's less. I don't want to say Sanders doesn't have a dog in that fight, but I think it's less it's not like Wall Street is for him. Right? Just Sanders doesn't seem to be. In any case, the only reason I brought up Occupy is I think they played a role. It would be interesting to see what that role was. What was the extent of that organization? To what extent was it sort of cobbled together versus, would they have 501c3? I would be surprised, but happy to learn that they were. So I don't know about the Proud Boys either, by the way, or Antifa. Or is there a 501c3 or some equivalent of that? In other words, are they organized? Are they a non-profit political group of some kind? Or do they have a tax basis? I don't know.
Yeah. I mean, I feel like I think with the Proud Boys, there's like you have to like sign something, like you have to like sign some. Because what's the Proud Boys deal? They're like, what's the phrase? Western chauvinists.
Chauvinists, yeah.
Yeah.
Could you repeat that phrase? You broke up when you uttered it.
Western chauvinist.
Oh.
So basically, they're just unapologetically pro the West.
Yeah, and I think they argue for
rejecting the value of multiculturalism, and being like the reason the West is at the top of the world is because our culture is the best, and these people are trying to say we're terrible, but we disagree. And they're actually not it's not a white, like anyone can sign up to it. It's not a white, you don't have to be white to be in the Proud Boys, but it is considered white supremacist because the culture that they're saying is the best culture is white culture, basically. Or at least
culture,
if you decide to equate Western culture with white culture.
Do they make that equation proudly? I mean, there are people who do. Do they? No.
I think they don't make that equivalent.
No. Okay. No, they don't.
Interesting. Well,
so I don't think Antifa. My point in saying this is I don't think Antifa has the same sort of like, this is like, sign this paper to be like, I agree with all of these things. Like, we're reacting against people trying to ruin our country. There's something more concrete about the Proud Boys, I think. Antifa is just, that's all I was just
right. But yeah, what's like the secondary effect of that though? Like, it seems like if a large group of people are acting in accordance with what they think the ideas of Antifa are you never able to say, like, there were these people who did a protest or burn something down? It just seems like it does leave all of the action. I mean, are there no people who are Antifa then, or do anything because of ideas?
No, there definitely are Antifa organizations for particular cities.
Didn't it grow out of Philadelphia? Does anybody remember that? That's my dim impression, is that it grew out of
Philadelphia,
maybe the housing crisis. All right, so this could be totally wrong. So large brackets here, but there was a housing insurrection. Seems to me it was something like a housing insurrection. What do I mean by a housing insurrection? What I remember about it, just from news reports and no research, is that there was quite famously a family or a group of families who occupied and wouldn't be thrown out, wouldn't be evicted from a building that they lived in. And I thought that was Philadelphia based, and there was a lot of actual or nearly actual, and I think a little bit of a lot of one and a little bit of the other. I think there was some actual violence and a lot more threatened. In what eventually, I think there was a standing down in that episode, but there was a very famous, at the time, episode about it, and that put it this way, I put 2 and 2 together when I heard, if I recall correctly, that Antifa grew out of that Philadelphia housing insurrection. My phrase, not no one else's. Insurrection seems to fit as a phrase for what I once understood as was going on in Philadelphia. So we could do a quick search on that, but that's my recollection is where the roots are. So what would be really fun to do is to build a lens, an Antifa lens and a Proud Boys lens. What I mean, you guys both know what I mean by that these days, right? Put together a narrative and compare and contrast those narratives and see to what extent, how much are they claiming? What do they think they know? Or what do they think they stand for anyway, if they don't think they know it? That would be a nice project. And in fact, now would be a really good time to do it. I think if I get some time, I'll try to invest in that by Friday. We could mind map those, for example, and try and generate a lens out of first just a data dump. And then in the way we tried to do with some weeks ago with Noam Chomsky's worldview, we tried to cobble together in some sort of propositional form some claims about the international space, the international geopolitical space in the world according to Chomsky. And I've got his book upstairs, Who Rules the World? And if I just got around to reading it, I'd have plenty of more information, more ammunition for that exercise we did a few weeks ago. And I'm suggesting we try to sketch it again. I think it's for these two groups. And along the way we'd learn a little bit. We'd have to do some research. But that sure would shed some light on what on earth is going on these days, because we're about to see a lot more of it, maybe.
Yeah, and the other big news out of the night, I think, was the fact that Joe Biden had a pretty easy time being like, yeah, if I lose the election, then I lose the election. Donald Trump was, it seemed, very evasive when it came to that question, and basically just fell on, well, the election probably is going to be rigged.
Would you say evasive, or would you say that he made it plain that he does not believe that a legitimate election is possible? Those are words 100% out of my mouth, not out of his, but it seems to me that's precisely the proposition that he was trying to advance.
Yes.
Without calling it a proposition and without putting it all in one place.
Yeah. I mean, I think, yeah, I would agree with that.
Yeah. No, I mean,
what do you guys think? What do you guys think of that whole issue? There's probably nowhere more cognitive dissonance these days than around the question of whether there is or is not any substantial election fraud evidence, right? At scale. We're not talking about a tiny episode here and a tiny episode there. The CNN fact checker guy, for example, during last night's debate, I jumped from channel to channel, watching and listening to various commentators, but he popped up and was ripped into that whole list which Trump provided. Trump threw what maybe half a dozen is roughly the right number of instances of election fraud that he rattled off. And I think he might have quantified, or in his way, semi-quantified. Semi when he says one number and then says another number and then pretends he said the same thing both times when he didn't, or something like that. If not exactly that, he does that kind of thing, right? Which makes it hard to pin down exactly what he said. But I do think he put a number. I don't remember what the number was. Tens of thousands rings a bell, but maybe I'm wrong about that. Maybe he didn't do that. That's a dim recollection. But what's not the dim recollection, what's a much clearer one, is a list of about half a dozen offenses against the election that he rattled off, and that were rattled off in turn in response on CNN as all of them false. But they were rattled off quickly, and nobody trotted out much evidence. You'd need a lot of evidence to do that with any care. So I'm asking, what do you know about that whole controversy, and what do you think about it?
Well, I think one of his biggest claims is that the coronavirus is being oversold in order to have more mail-in ballots, and that mail-in ballots are much more easily manipulatable. And then he had a couple different ways, and in instances where that happened, no matter how small they were.
Right.
But I think that's his biggest claim.
Yeah, he made a distinction in that regard between, was his word solicited? It was the functional equivalent of requested ballots, which he thinks are okay, versus the kind that are just sent out to everybody, which he thinks are not okay. Biden popped up and said, wait, we've had states doing that. Biden, I think, said the number was 5, right? That have been sending unsolicited ballots to every voter and he gave some number of years, and it was not a short number.
Yeah.
I forget. And I don't know. I presume that what he says is roughly true in that regard. That's my impression as to what happens in Washington State, for example, that everybody's. There is, for example, a voter pamphlet which goes out. It's a quite substantial document, and it goes out to everybody in the state. I know this because, and I've seen it, because Lisa's aunt actually had a painting on the cover of it. So it went out to every registered voter in Washington. I've thought that for years in any case. I've seen the document. It's a big, thick document, and I thought it was sent out to everybody. That's my recollection of how it works there. So I wouldn't be surprised if what I've heard, that Washington also sends out ballots to every single voter and has for a long time. I think that might be right.
I mean, I'm pretty sure that's what they do in Oregon.
Those leftist liberal states. Yeah.
Yeah.
So they send it to the address of every registered voter or something?
Yeah. Yep. Yeah,
it's not exactly unsolicited when you register to vote, right? Especially if you register to vote in a state where they send you this stuff. I don't know where you could make the case that, okay, they're solicited because in that state you register to vote when you know they're going to send you the stuff. So the registering is the solicitation, right? It is the request. You could make that case and then try and exempt everybody else.
Yeah, well, there's probably a lot of registered voters who don't vote. So the number would be a lot bigger if you just sent it out to every registered voter, rather than, or I guess.
Bigger than what? Bigger than
is the number of
specifically request a ballot.
Right. So yeah. So the number of people registered would be much larger than the people who would request a ballot every year.
Sure, that must be true.
Yeah.
Yeah. Or you might say larger than the number of people who would otherwise request a ballot every year, because in those states, in a certain way, they already have requested a ballot every year, because the way they vote in those states, and here I'm not paying any attention to what came first, the registration or the approach to voting. There's some margin there. Ignore that. But where you do register in a state in which that's the regime, that's the voting mechanism, to register is to request a ballot. I mean, that's what if you got any sense, thinks is going to happen to you, because that's the way you vote in this state.
Mm-hmm.
It's all by mail, and you'll get it. And that's no doubt said when you register. Right? When I register vote, you know, in Indiana, you get assigned to a precinct and you have to go there. And you know what a precinct is. If you register to vote, you know there's a polling place, right? And it's, you probably know the fancy name, which is a precinct. I think it is anyway. So, and probably in the same way, I'm just making the case that, I mean, how would the argument go that it's okay it's terrible, it's rife with fraud if you send out unsolicited ballots? And then the response is, wait, 5 states have been doing this for a lot of years, and there's no evidence of at scale fraud, right, in those states. And the answer might be, well, I'm not talking about those. Someone could park those over in the solicited column. I'm talking about under COVID, right, which is a brand new deal where people don't expect that. And we're sending them out. And I don't know who they send them out to. Do they send them out to all registered voters, or do they send them out to everybody who pays taxes? You know what I mean? Just in case they're eligible to vote. I don't know. Do they send it out to every household they've got a record of for? I simply don't know. There's a lot of possibilities here.
Yeah, I don't know exactly what the Republican claims are for all the fraud that's likely to happen. I mean, I've heard like a bunch of like small cases of like a postman throwing out some ballots or something. But I think
Trump's claim was that he sold ballots last night.
Yeah.
Gave an example of somebody, and the CNN response was, no, we didn't sell them. It was a postman who, as a joke, changed. He said, as a joke, changed from something that it said Democratic to something that said Republican on the ballot. That was, if I'm remembering correctly, the claim that was made by the CNN fact checker last night. I don't know. Of course, whether he's right.
Yeah, I mean, that would certainly be concerning if those votes went through, I guess. But yeah, I think the biggest problem with mail-in voting is the amount of votes that are invalidated by, I think, mostly signatures that don't match. And I think it gets into like the tens of thousands. I think if you do a national election. So
consider that fraud versus inefficiency. Have you heard any discussion of that? I mean, I can see why you might not want to gamble on.
Oh yeah, there's definitely a difference,
right? Yeah. Especially my signature sucks these days. Hardly have one. I don't sign that often, right? Yeah. So I'd hate to have somebody look at my signature and compare it to exactly what was when I first registered to vote. Right.
Although I can't remember if this was a case I saw in like the West Wing or something, but they might have like people checking the validity of these signatures, which seems kind of insane to me. But I guess you could argue that that's where the fraud element could come in. They might be more likely to validate the vote of their choice, of their party's choice, and not validate a signature from a party they don't like.
You're talking about election workers now, is that right?
Yeah.
Some kind of election counting. People are counting votes.
Yeah.
There's also another role we should mention, and that is the role of a second signature on these things. And at least in some states, you have to have someone who verifies that they know you and that you're the person who signed or something like that. The way a notary public would, but I don't think you have to have them notarized. That's a very hard requirement to meet for a lot of people.
Mm-hmm.
But I do think you have to have a second person who signs it. The way wills used to be done commonly in the United States, you didn't used to have them notarized. in some states anyway. I think I know this just from seeing a bunch of old wills and genealogical research.
Yeah. Yeah, so I will say I don't know a ton of all the specific claims about voter fraud.
Yeah.
It seems like, Republicans are definitely all up in arms about it and how disastrous the mail-in vote will be. And the Democrats have their own pretty extensive or election fraud and election stealing claims as well.
Disenfranchisement claims or something else?
Disenfranchisement, social media, ad bombing, Russia interference. I think. What's that?
I just wonder if you could repeat that last thing you said, John. My internet connection grew unstable just for a moment.
Social media campaigns, Russian interference, disenfranchisement, but it does seem like there's these whole group of claims that Democrats are, it seems, much more realistic claims, but has them equally as ready to invalidate the outcome of the election if it does not favor their party.
Why do you say as equally? That would be news to me. I've not seen. Look, for example, on the presidential stage, that was not equal last night, right? That was radically unequal.
Yeah.
Do you agree?
I think I don't. I guess it's hard. My impression is that Biden is certainly not in step with the entirety of his party on that one. And he also, you can say that, yeah, if I clearly lose the vote count, then I obviously will step down and Trump will be president. But you could be totally in line with that statement come election day, and you say, well, there's some discrepancies here. I didn't clearly lose.
Sure, that's right. So let's take a real case. How about the Georgia gubernatorial election last time? Stacey Abrams, right, was in a barn burner against the Secretary of State, who was in charge of the elections, who would not recuse himself from running the elections, who was running for governor, right? If I've got my timeline correct.
Yeah, I think that's right. Or at least I knew it was his job to be in charge of elections as he was running.
Which is unbelievable.
Yeah.
Anyway.
So Abrams' response was a very distinct one, right? She challenged it, certainly.
Mm-hmm.
But then in the end, she made a distinction, and all I want to say is that it was a careful distinction, and the following uncareful distinction is my best recollection of her careful one. Trying to make that distinction a careful one. Right? It was something like, I don't accept the way the election was run, but it's over, and he's the governor.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Something like that. So she acknowledged at the end of a process whose legitimacy she did not acknowledge was nonetheless over, and he's the governor. So that wraps some kind of other limited time transparency mechanism for transparency and oversight, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that doesn't play itself out in a reasonable time frame, then the election ends in an orderly way, right? Someone could make that kind of distinction, right? Turns out she's a pretty smart lady when you listen to her talk. So maybe not everybody could make that kind of careful distinction. Maybe she's more clever than some. But on the other hand, these are great big apparatus, whatever the plural I should use in English language these days, apparatuses or something, right? Big party machines, better word, I can pluralize. And those big party machines have got plenty of smart people in them who can formulate exactly the right distinctions and sell them politically, right, in very careful ways. So it's not as if we can't get those distinctions to bubble to the top. And if people aren't using them, it's either because they suck at running their machines or they're not interested in running their machines. I don't know what other conclusions to draw. Because there's plenty of firepower in both of those machines to make careful distinctions like Abrams made. Like the uncareful one, maybe uncareful that I just made, at least uncareful in the sense that I don't want to pin that very one on her. I forget exactly how she put it. It was something very much like that.
So what is there a process? Like, what's the process for dealing with a contested election?
State by state. That's the 3-word short answer. And then what happens if the state by state isn't particularly well liked? Can it be challenged somewhere else? And there I have another 3-word answer. Turns out Bush v. Gore, right, which was the hanging Chad Supreme Court case.
Yeah, which would be particularly disastrous if we ended up at that point now, I think. But
it would be unfortunate that it went that far, and it would be suspected by all kinds of folks. Although I have to admit that the 6 versus 3 narrative, here I've been too influenced perhaps by Amy Barrett's remarks on this matter, right? So I've listened to JP, thank you for the Hillsdale heads up, because I listened to that one since you last mentioned it. And I also listened to the one, I think you're the one who corrected me that it was at Jacksonville. I thought it was Jackson University, but maybe it was Jacksonville something, or maybe there's more than one of them. In any case, I listened to one there that was right around the 2016 election. And in both cases, she makes a very clear distinction between what she thinks of liberal and conservative in terms of jurisprudence, which she's quite willing to admit, and says that's a very different distinction than the political versus a political liberal versus conservative sense. And anybody who thinks those are the same, in Amy Barrett's case, I'm pretty sure are in for a big surprise. Or at least that would be my reading of her. Maybe it's a prejudiced reading of her, but it's not now an uncareful reading of her. I mean, I haven't read her law review articles on this subject, but she speaks about it pretty distinctly, and says these are not the same. So you would not expect, put it this way, in the abstract, you would not expect somebody who Trump reported installed because the Federalist Society picked her, because she was an originalist and a textualist. You wouldn't expect that person to necessarily vote for the Republican. It would depend upon the law. It's like people don't even think there's any law there to be interpreted, or there's any serious-minded interpretation that goes on there. And without looking at the detail of the law, which almost nobody discusses in this regard, I have not heard a discussion of it. I'm sure in law review articles there's plenty of discussion of it, but you don't see it in the big national TV or print media or blogosphere discussions of exactly what the law is and how it would be interpreted by what sort of jurisprudence. Put it this way, that discussion has got to exist because this is the internet, but I have yet to find it. So we should look for it.
Yeah, I'm sure it'd be a monstrous article because, like you said, it goes state by state.
Right. At first, it does.
And then there's probably another process on top of that. Like, does each state go to the Supreme Court? You know, like in that case, like if there's a disagreement in every state, I mean,
it's a good question.
Like,
but it would have to be reasonably close, right?
Yeah.
And there would have to be people. Presumably, they all have some kind of mechanism.
Yeah.
Where there's some group of people who get some set of facts on some sort of schedule, right, and have to publicly take a stand. And if it's ridiculous set of facts, It's going to be hard to find a large group of people to take that stand. It looks like it's 60-40, right? I mean, in that case, right, there just aren't that many disputed votes. And to dispute votes is to dispute them in particular, not, you can't just wave your hand at the process. Not, put it this way, not at the level of state voting machinery, right? Not at that level. That there's law there, and lawyers wrote that stuff.
Yeah, although it does seem in the event that we do have a super contested and close election in all these swing states, with there being a lot more mail-in votes, that margin of error seems like it might be bigger than ever before in a more hotly contested race than before in more states. So there's more votes up for contention. So even if the race didn't seem particularly close, there might be more votes up for contention than usual, just by virtue of being mostly mail-in. Although I don't know if that's the case or not, but
right, at least more largely mail-in than they have been in the past, right?
Yeah.
So there's,
so there might be like a lot more states like Florida and a lot more swing states like Florida.
Has anybody got numbers on the top of their head with regard to mail-in votes? The only one I dimly recall hearing was a factor of 4. I thought I'd heard, and that this may be, again, I'm just starting with something and it's hearsay, right? But I thought I'd heard it claimed that, yes, we've had lots of mail-in voting in the past, but there's some projections that we may have 4 times the amount of mail-in voting as in years past. That's at least a number to start with.
Yeah, I haven't heard.
Has anyone heard numbers like that or done any reading in that space?
I haven't.
I do not have a number.
Well, that would be helpful. I mean, are we talking an order of magnitude increase here? Are we talking double? How long does it usually take to process? You know, that would be a complex function, wouldn't it? Right? With all of the various state laws, all of the various changes in mail-in voting, all of the turnout predictions, what else would go into that function? I mean, this is sort of reminds me of that function of, is there intelligent life on other planets? You ever seen that large equation that somebody's come up with? There's a large equation in which they basically drop in all the areas in which you need to put a probability assignment in order to get an outcome. Percentage of life on other, percentage of probability that there's life on other planets. That equation is famous and has a name, and I can neither remember the equation nor the name. But this would be like that, right? It would be a pretty complex function of a lot of various pieces. We should look for that too. That some computers, somebody's modeled this, right? I mean, this is what computer modelers do for a living.
Yeah.
So some election geeks are on it.
Yeah, it's funny when I'm listening to the 538 podcast, they keep on referring to the model as if it's some like all-knowing or living thing that we'll just have to look at the model or always go back to the model. But yeah, I'm sure it's something similar for that, like there is for determining the outcome of the election. But
sure. Well, they must have a cool model they're referring to. They're working with. Yep. So we should actually pop up a model. I'm going to look for that too. Let's pop up a model because we could understand a model. I mean, there's got to be an agent-based model. Got another bobcat? What's that?
It's a bug.
Dang, how disappointing.
Wait patiently.
Anyway, we should come up with a model. Have you ever seen an agent-based model or I'm thinking of what's the kind of software. JP, you probably use some of this. Vensim. You ever use Vensim or something like that?
I don't remember.
Okay. Well, that's pretty
I
cool.
don't remember using something like that.
I'm trying to remember the other approach besides agent-based modeling. An agent-based model, and you basically identify all these little things and you treat them like agents. And they have inputs and they have outputs and they have connections, right? And you just build it up. And there are other approaches to modeling as well. And I'm a bit far removed from them. But the nice thing about them is you can represent them without code. In fact, there's interfaces to build them without code, where you literally just drag the way you do in a MATLAB GUI tool or something like that, where there's a little bit of code, or there may even be, in some cases, there's a desktop interface and you just grab things together and connect them. Think of our MindUp interface, for example, right? That interface, imagine that when you drag various things together, you were actually establishing, it was writing code as you dragged. That kind of interface exists for a lot of kind of modeling, and then you just look at it and it looks like a MindUp map. And I'm sure those things exist for voting. So we should find them. In fact, you mind if I share a screen for a moment?
Go for it.
Let's just take a minute and do it. So I'm going to pull up. I should be careful when I share a screen, actually, because I got a bunch of stuff on the screen. Oh, good. This is YouTube. Never mind YouTube.
You need some more extensions, Uncle Tom.
That was actually us. Yeah, I do.
Holy crap. That is wild.
Yeah, I get a few. This is probably a serious security violation, just showing what I have running on this thing. Advertising to the world how many backdoors there are.
Is that
audience of 0 will be amused. All right.
The reason Chrome uses so much RAM, I think, is because it runs every single extension on every single tab you have open. So, yeah, I think you're using up quite a bit of your computer.
I am.
I'm surprised it's still running so smoothly, to be honest.
All right, so this is all interesting, but here's what I wanted to do. Sometimes this is a great way to search, right? Just type in what you want, and then just very, very quickly, for example, boom, right? We're getting close. So here's a computer model, the sort of thing I'm talking about, and here are others. So let's click on this. And I'm just saying, towards security modeling e-voting systems. Shucks. I may have bitten off a little more than I wanted to chew here. Let's go to figure 4. And let's make it bigger and see if any of the words are in English, right? Yeah, I mean, look at this. Robustness, fairness, long-term, can't read the rest of it. Accuracy, privacy, right? Eligibility, accountability, variability. Good. So this is exactly what I meant. And this is all I really wanted to go for. There are models like this. Of course there are, right? Where if you identify what all the parameters are and you relate them up to one another, and you figure, in how many ways does each parameter influence the other, and you put a simple mathematical model, right? This depends on that thing cubed, right? Because it shows in more than once, et cetera. And you run all those together and you get, there's code analogous to this whole thing. Sometimes literally there's an interface that it's exactly like this, and you just drag stuff around and you type stuff in and you link it up and you drop in, you drop in a tiny little equation, and the software is happy to take your input that way and spit out its writing code in the background, and the way Excel does or something like that from the stuff you put in a cell. So anyway, we should find those. These have got to exist, and we should do a little work and find them. Stop dangerous share. All right. All right. Any other ground since we're doing all this? You know what we ought to do? We could use Rachel because she really did it well last time. We should take notes and mind map of these things as we go, because we did actually just cover a lot of territory. And it is true that we've got a transcript for this, which is nice, but it'd be nice to turn that transcript into a quick visualization where you could just sort of drop a visualization on a conversation when you're done. Say, oh, we talked about all this stuff, and you'd get it. In 15 seconds, you'd understand roughly what was talked about, if not the very order, and then you could decide whether you wanted to go consult the transcript or, God forbid, play the movie. Play the video. All right. Well, we'll see as we go. Anything else on either of your minds?
Oh man.
That you want to talk about here?
Yeah. I don't know. I mean, not related. I don't have much else related to the election, I guess. I mean, I would say that my biggest concern is tons of ballots being thrown out. I mean, I think that's going to be the cause. If the election has a problem, that's going to be it. And I expect it to take a month.
Yeah.
I expect it to be mid-December before we have an idea.
I wouldn't be surprised. Does that bother you if that were true?
Yes.
What part of it bothers you?
Because it gives a month for both sides to build up these really, really strong narratives of why they're the side that's actually winning and how the other side is cheating. And when it finally, the result comes in, I think the narrative, people are going to be absolutely convinced, unless it's not close at all. But I think people are going to be really convinced, no matter what, that the election was not fair.
Why don't we just call that 2016 and look back at it, right? I mean, yes, their circumstances were way different. You got the popular vote difference, that's for sure. You got the Russian interference narrative, right? Very big narratives. And yet we had a completely clear transition of power.
Yeah, I mean,
Donald Trump would say otherwise. In fact, he did say otherwise last night, right? Making an excuse in a way for his presidency, one might say, right? In that he never really got off the ground. In fact, somewhere in the past, way in the past, he's questioned about whether he should be able to run for a third term because the first one didn't count, right? Precisely because of that challenge. Who knows whether that was serious? That was a news report. I didn't hear exactly what he said about it.
I mean, he says that he likes to. No, he's definitely said that he likes to make jokes about it too, because he says
it's good for a laugh at his rallies.
Yeah,
it's definitely good for a laugh at his rallies.
He says a lot of stuff, and then he later says he was joking, right? In fact, last night he said that stuff about, is there some sort of system of cleaning the inside of your body that you can use? Is there some sort of way you can get that on the inside?
Yeah.
Oh, he was joking, right? But if you watch that, there's not a, okay, here it gets pretty partisan.
I mean, I think it's at the very least,
Bullshit,
it was
right?
pretty, yeah, definitely. Yeah.
He was wondering aloud. Wondering aloud. And if he just said so, if he could just say, hey, look, I was wondering aloud for a minute. I was not prescribing. There's many ways he could have taken that back. He didn't. He said he was joking. And he says that a lot. And maybe he does joke, and to float things as a technique to immunize
Well,
himself from criticism about what he says.
Yeah.
Or maybe people are just uptight and accuse him of stuff when he is joking. All that probably happens.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Anyway,
But yeah, he certainly uses that one a lot, when I think it's pretty clear from any angle you take it that he was not joking, and then he'll just totally walk it back that he was joking.
yeah. But we digress, right? Because I did, my bad. Because I was asking you what bothered you about an election that takes a month to work itself out because it's complex this year, and where both sides have some narrative that they're pushing and have court cases. And it seems to me, in some respect, that it's always been like that. The only thing I can think of that's plainly different. Well, no, let's list them. Brainstorm. What's different this time?
It hasn't always been like this. I mean, I remember in 2016 on the election day when Trump won, and I just remember everyone being like, he won.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I remember it vividly because I was in a bar and like no one could believe it. It was just quiet in the bar.
No, I agree.
It was surreal. But like that's not going to be the case this year. I mean,
depends on how the election results go.
If Biden wins like 350 electoral college votes,
right?
It might not be. I mean, that's best case. I mean, that's the only way that this works out in a reasonably quick way, because there's no way Trump wins by a lot. There's no way.
Well, suppose he did, right? I mean, we said that once before. So suppose he did win by a lot. I mean, a great deal, a lot. Suppose he were up by 50, and here I'm speaking kind of in ignorance. You needed James Carville or somebody, right, who's been doing this 100 years, who can pull out a number off the top of his head based upon contested states, right? I can't do that. But suppose he won by that number, whatever those guys would say, well, that's a blowout, right? He lost everywhere he could possibly lose, or he won everywhere he could possibly win, right? Because that's the point we were talking about here. And he won by, I'm going to make up the number and call it 50 electoral votes. I don't see why that couldn't. The country's been stunned before. It could be stunned again on just the way you referred to is in the bar.
One narrative that I've seen already that's accounting for that basically is Democrats expect Republican votes to come in faster because Republicans are more likely to vote in person. So I think one of the worst case scenarios that they're already imagining is Donald Trump winning pretty clearly by the Electoral College on election night and basically declaring victory. And then over the next 3 weeks or whatever, as all the mail-in ballots are counted, a couple of the swing states he ends up losing. And
you're right. That's very insightful. You're right. That some of that always happens, right? Because big cities are the hardest typically to count, and they're typically Democratic. So if you watch election after election, you're used to waiting for the Democratic vote to come in big urban centers. And usually much more quickly, but not universally, are the outlying districts. They tend to come in faster, although some of them are so small that there are usually a few small Republican, typically last time Republican held districts, right? Generally Trump, generally rural, right? Those more recently red and maybe for a long time red are an exception to that rule, but I still think that's the majority rule for a long time. So you have to get used to that. And how long have we had that? I mean, what's the worst that happens? Dewey defeats Truman. I'm being a little bit of a devil's advocate here, right? But I'm just going back to history and saying this has happened before. And it could be, put it this way, I wouldn't want to be too bent out of shape by a Dewey defeats Truman episode now, right? We might say, you know what? Let's wait and see. Just be patient. See how it develops. Now, I say just be patient if you're an average listener. I'm not, the machines are running full speed ahead, right? And they're being far from patient. They're desperately doing everything they can. And if they stay within reasonably the bounds of the law, I say they ought to stay completely within the bounds of the law, of course. But probably there are edge effects, right? There's probably some number of oversteps. There isn't any complex process. And there will be accusations floated. And we should expect all of that. And we should not be bent out of shape by it, it seems to me. And that's true if we're a week into it, because we've been a week into it before. We were in an intensely close election, right? Bush v. Gore. And we were a long week into it, weren't we? I should remember better than you how long that was, but I think it was something. It was a long week into it, I think, before that court case went to the Supreme Court. It went quickly, but there were a number of days. Actually, there was a long weekend. That's right. So elections are always on a Tuesday, and there was a long weekend in Florida because I was at Fermiland that weekend, actually, marveling over the Minos detector. I shared the story before, watching muons be shot through the ground and being caught in a mine in Minnesota in that case, under a big cord underneath the Earth's surface, right? And it's a marvel of international cooperation during Bush v. Gore. So I remember when it was, and it was over a weekend. So, but I don't remember exactly when the court ruled, but it was a number of days later, and we survived. Now it's true we weren't coming out of COVID.
Gore, my recollection, my understanding is Gore went along with it. You know, I mean, Gore kind of was like, okay, that's fine.
Sure, maybe a Stacey Abrams sort of going along with it. He may have thought it was illegitimate. I don't remember. I'm not trying to put words in his mouth. My guess is something like that is the case. They did after all contest it. Right?
Yeah, and I just can't really, I mean, I think I imagine in any scenario in which Trump wins, there's going to be massive protests,
Sure.
Which, I mean, I guess fine, but.
Yeah, but remember the Women's March on Washington when he won the last time.
Yeah.
That was massive protests right away, all over the country.
Yeah, and then depending on how
violence is the most recent set of protests.
Depending on how egregious Trump makes it sound, if he ends up losing, I mean, I think there could be significant unrest from those smaller right-wing groups. Yeah, so I mean, we can hope that they would all be nice, peaceful marches like the Women's March, but I think I can certainly imagine on both sides of the outcome that they will be a lot more violent than
Sure, I can too, but then it might be as bad as, for example, we just lived through after George Floyd. And before that, after Ferguson. And or right, Michael, and I'm sorry, I can't remember his name, in New York City.
Oh, Garner.
Yeah.
No, Eric.
So we've had a lot of unrest, and we survived it. We have ebb and flow. We have.
Yeah, I mean, I'm certainly not fearing the downfall of the republic, but I mean, I think it's gonna be. It's not gonna be good, I think.
Yeah. But I think we ought to expect. I mean, I think in general it's good for the citizenry to expect. How do I put this? We ought to expect the machine to function. When we don't expect it to function by a narrative in which we're to a boiling point, and this is radically different than anything we've ever seen before, and et cetera. And I think there's not much question that the temperature is, I don't know how else to put it. It seems to me it's fairly a nonpartisan claim to claim that temperature is being incited is being elevated by the president's speech. The partisan issue would be whether he's right to do so or not, right? Whether he's completely right in doing so. But I guess this is a partisan point then. I'm suggesting we keep the temperature down and we expect and we give time for
right. I mean, that's certainly the way it would go ideally. But how we would wish it to happen and how it will most likely play out seems to be different. And this might be
insist it happens. That's what I think. We ought to insist that it happens. Everybody ought to, on every side of the political spectrum, ought to insist that it happens, that we do it civilly. We should.
I mean, I think both sides of the aisle have, for a while now, been implying that the machine is breaking down, and this might be an unfair characterization, but the Democrats have been implying to some extent that the machine broke down last time. So why should they expect it to work this time?
It seems to me there are two kinds of threads there. One is that the system is misdesigned last time and always said and has been for a long time, right? We ought to separate out that claim. The system runs, and the reason that matters, I'm talking about electoral college versus a popular vote, right? And folks who, you'll find a lot of people talking about that and objecting to that, but they don't say we don't know who the president is because of that. They say the system is broken and has been right along and ought to be changed, and they object to the president, and they might even question his legitimacy, in some sense of legitimacy, in terms of puristic popularity, but they're not suggesting that the U.S. government has no president on that grounds. It seems to me, or virtually, if someone does, that's a very strange. That's a fringe view of the people.
I wasn't going as much on the electoral college thing, and I mean, I think there was a whole.
Bringing it out one at a time. Go ahead.
Yeah, there was a whole group of people. Hashtag not my president. Hashtag resist.
Right.
And I think they were implying that the machine was broken by Facebook ads and Russian interference in a way that has not been fixed. And it was broken last time and it's still broken. I mean, I guess Republicans don't have the social, or I forget the name of the company that they used that worked with Facebook. Cambridge Analytica. So, I mean, I think there was some big documentary called Hacking the Election or something. So the implication was largely that the machine broke and we didn't get the election that we were supposed to. I think that was implied really strongly by a lot of people.
But we need a stronger distinction than you're making there, because it seems to me we need additional distinctions than the ones you're making, I think. Here's why I think it. It's one thing to say that we've got this AI, AI/information flow, big data challenge, where what we thought the way we thought elections needed to go can't go that way anymore and don't go that way anymore. And that's a huge problem. It's one thing to say that, it's another thing to say, and because that's so, I no longer accept the results of the elections, right? I don't recognize the legal authority of things coming from the White House, et cetera, right? Executive orders lack the force of law. You see very little of that, I would say, and not my president and resist, and even violent protest resist advocacy. Even that, one can advocate violent protest against a regime without saying that there's no regime there or no legitimate regime there. You might think this legitimate regime is doing things that are deeply wrong and to which the appropriate civil response is even violent protest. Even you might even grant that, and yet you don't challenge the legitimacy of the government. That's a different thing that you're saying. You're saying it ought to be resisted when it does wrong, and it ought to be resisted on some occasions, even to the point of violence. Civil disobedience anyway, certainly law breaking, right? That's the whole, I mean, Martin Luther King took such a stance, right? Mm-hmm. Civil disobedience, yes. Maybe nonviolent civil disobedience, but civil disobedience. And that doesn't mean that the laws aren't that there is no law, right? Or that the whole system is broken down. No, there is law, but our circumstances require us to violate some of them for a legitimate, important reason. There's, I think, a lot of that ought not to be painted over by anybody on either side as throwing out the baby with the bathwater, throwing out the whole legitimacy of the government.
Yeah.
We do not live under the structure. We don't recognize this governmental structure. Yes, we do, but we point out all kinds of flaws in it, and we're going to resist them in all kinds of ways.
Yeah, I think maybe it's not super helpful because I don't know how big the "not my president" thing was, or how long it stuck around as a major movement, if at all. But I mean, I think my impression of it was actually he's legitimately not the president. Like, he is illegitimate. That was the implication.
Yeah, I didn't read it that way, but you could be right. Let's look for cases. Let's look for cases, because I think actually that's where the seeds of the future come from, right? Are these reactions in the past? And so I always took that to be not my president and resist was exactly the same thing that's being said when somebody who's never Trump, right? Or called themselves a never Trumper, right? And in fact, I called myself that and had zero objection to the legitimacy of the election or the legitimacy of the government based on it. I was a never Trumper because I thought the man made people worse. That was my core objection. He made people worse, and he did it intentionally. And I still think that's the case. And I think you see the fruit of it to this day. And in that sense, I was a never Trumper, but I don't recognize the legitimacy of Trump's government.
Yeah, I mean, and I think a lot of people are like that. And I guess I don't know the extent of the movement or if they all believed it that strongly, but I mean, I do think people legitimately believe that and I think a lot of people said this and thought this, is that he stole the election. And I think in my head, what that means is that they think he's an illegitimate president if he stole the election using all of these various different.
Yeah, I still want to make more distinctions for those people, right?
I'm sure you could divide them up into different groups, and it's hard to know until you ask them exactly what they meant. But
we have a system of laws, and we have people who will steal a trial. They'll steal a verdict, right? But you might say they broke the law. They did all kinds of stuff, but you're not there by saying that there was no verdict, or that the verdict doesn't have the force of law. It does, but it was unjustly, in fact, maybe even illegally arrived at, and it still has the force of law because there's a mechanism that sits on top of it, and you have to challenge it. If you can prove what you say, you have to prove it, right? And you have to prove it to the satisfaction of that overseeing mechanism. That's the appeals process, right? And there's all kinds of room for things like that, including things about the election, it seems to.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess I'm not sure how important I think this point is, or if it's true at all that a lot of people were under that impression and thought that way. I don't even know how I would go about confirming that impression, or how important it is that I come to that conclusion. But
well, let's table it and keep an eye on it, because obviously we're going to see it. These currents are going to bubble to the surface. They're already in the surface, right? And they're going to bubble up harder.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thanks, guys. Thanks for spending some time.
Yeah.
JP, thanks for the Bobcat story, man. Thanks for the Bobcat film. I can't believe you got that on film. That's the coolest thing ever.
Yeah, I'm hoping to see more elk. There's they have quite a trail right in front of me here.
Oh, nice.
And I've seen them here a few times, so I'm hoping someday soon to see them again, because they got all the I don't know, I hear them over here. There's another meadow over here someplace, and I hear them all the time. But it'd be fun to be sitting here and just watch the whole herd just run right up through this valley here. I'll be ready. I got my camera. I got my phone.
We'll have to ask your mom, but I dimly recall when we rafted the Snake River together a long time ago. I completely clearly recall that I walked up. I was out fishing, got a trout, which was fun, and then heard. No, I guess I didn't hear him. I didn't hear him. I just walked up just to see what I could see up a side of a mountain, and looked down and saw a huge herd of elk. I dimly remember that your mom might have been involved in that fishing expedition somehow. I wonder but I don't remember her up there.
Yeah.
But anyway, we were near the same elk. Cool stuff. All right. Thanks, guys.
All right.
Yep. All right. See you all
Talk
later.
to you soon.